Recently, we heard from two Republican pollsters who weighed the 2024 presidential election from their perspective. Today, we hear the flip side. Our guest is Patrick Toomey, a partner and major league pollster with BSG, who once worked on the Obama White House polling team and who this year is a vital part of Cook Political Report's bipartisan swing state project. He's trying to figure out who's up, who's down, and who projects it will be rural and first-time voters who are going to decide which agent of change occupies the White House. From Ballard Studios in Washington, D.C., it's 13th and Park.
We give you information, not a panic attack.
I mean, look what's going on. I mean, my God.
This was it. Like, kids were gonna die.
That time is gone forever.
This is the biggest story in America.
We weren't prepared for this.
Don't you want to speak truth to power?
Toughest thing I ever had to do.
Patrick, great to have you on 13th and Park. For our viewers and our listeners, you're doing all this work for the Cook Political Report on the swing states. Why is it that we now live in not a popular vote presidential period, but in an electoral vote period where it's not about who wins the most votes, it's about who wins the most electoral votes, and those seem to be determined more and more by just a handful of states?
That certainly has always been the case. It just has often been the case and continues to more often than not be the case that the winner of the popular vote is also the winner of the Electoral College. But as you're pointing out, that it's the Electoral College that counts. So on the Democratic side of the aisle, we tend to like to lament this. We also, in 2000, the Democrats won the national popular vote, but we didn't win the presidency because we didn't win the right mix of states. I think we've learned our lesson, and I know Republicans know this as well. You got to focus on the swing states where voters could go either way.
Well, I'll tell you, the swing states all appreciate, if nothing else, all the television ad dollars. I think I read in Pennsylvania, it's going to end up being something like $200 million in just the general election in the last 10 weeks. I mean, it's like off the chart. It's not even breaking records. It's like shattering them.
Right.
It's because of the fact that Pennsylvania is one of those states in all the permutations, right, that could kind of make the game for somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's various paths, and I know there are paths that don't go through Pennsylvania, but those are very difficult paths. It seems like the most straightforward approach is Harris has to win Pennsylvania to win.
So let's go right into your research, your most recent data. There are 4 slides in particular. The first one talks about how the majority of voters believe Harris represents a chance to turn the page on the Biden-Trump era, ushering in a new generation of leadership. Is that what's underneath this particular piece of data that shows that there's a coming home effect as Harris became the candidate as a replacement for Joe Biden?
Yeah, listen, sometimes you have to really dig through the crosstabs and the nitty gritty to figure out what's going on in voters' minds. And sometimes the answer is staring you right in the face. Many voters told any pollster, told anyone who'd be willing to listen, we do not like our choices in this race. We would like a choice other than Trump or Biden. I think it was Nikki Haley who actually was the one who said, the first party that ditches their standard bearer, that's the party that's going to win. Now, I'm not saying this is in the bag for Harris. It's obviously been a great win for her, but she's certainly in a much stronger position than Biden is. And one of the key reasons for that is that she is seen as representing a new generation of leadership, as our data has found, and an opportunity to turn the page on this era of Biden and Trump. That's what our data is showing. I have to imagine the Harris campaign data is showing the same thing, since that was such a core component of her message during the debate, using those exact phrases and words.
Do you think, Patrick, that there was a sense of relief that a lot of Democrats had when the president decided not to seek re-election, especially after the very difficult debate he had with Donald Trump, that is reflected in these numbers, and that these numbers are not only representative of maybe the mood change in the swing states, but nationally as well?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think anyone who knows a Democrat and knew a Democrat earlier this summer knew how we were all feeling and how on edge we were, particularly after that first debate.
Right.
It was a huge relief. I think a lot of what we saw in this poll, which, to be transparent, fielded at the beginning of August, it's been a little bit of time since it passed, was voters giving Harris the benefit of the doubt. They wanted a change, they got a change, and they wanted to be optimistic about what that change could mean. We'll see come election day if she is able to sort of hold on to that positive sentiment. But in our polling, and I think a lot of the polling to date, we're seeing both Democrats who would maybe been flirting with a third party vote, maybe were considering staying home. They just weren't sure that they believed enough in Biden for it to be worth them turning out to vote. They've come home. We're also seeing independents, and in particular, voters who used to be the fixation of this race, the double haters, the folks who were unfavorable to both Biden and Trump. Those folks in particular moved to Harris immediately. And those are voters who are more likely than the average voter to describe Harris as representing an opportunity to change the page, representing a new generation of leadership. It's interesting. They described her similarly to voters overall on many other fronts, but on those two fronts in particular, they were much more likely to say that describes Harris. And I think that's really key.
Independents under 45, independent women, middle-income households, white, non-college women, and men of color are more likely to be undecided. Again, this is in the swing states. Tell me, why do you think that is?
Some of these folks, they may know how they think and feel about Trump. They may not all be familiar with Harris and are wanting to learn more. Again, certainly in early August, they were eager to learn more. I think many of these voters feel cross-pressured between a perspective on the economy and on abortion specifically, but I think also what stances on abortion tell them about who this person is, what they believe, and what type of leader they're going to be. I think that's particularly true for women. We tend to focus on, women are more focused on abortion than men. One, I don't always see that in my poll, but one thing that I do see women tend to be even more likely to be focused on than men is actually the economy, affordability. And so those voters in particular are, trying to weigh, I'm not happy with where inflation is today. I'm not happy with where the economy is today. Maybe I blame President Biden for some amount of that or even all of that. And maybe I feel like things were better off when Trump was president. But I also know he's the one who installed the Supreme Court justices who took away the right to abortion.
But this isn't quite like, or maybe it is, like 2022, the midterm when I think abortion was red hot. It was right in the heels of the decision coming from the Supreme Court. And even though at that point, a lot of Americans were, you might say, almost as pessimistic then as they are now about many things, still that issue was kind of the wedge issue, it seemed to be, especially with women. Then you advance to 24, Patrick. There was an assumption I and many others made that it wouldn't be quite as determinative, but maybe that's not quite right, at least in certain states.
2022 being a midterm election, obviously there wasn't a presidential election then. We have seen in our research that, voters do believe the president can have a big effect on the economy. I think there's less of a sense that my individual senator or my individual congressperson is going to really change the national economic dynamics. So I think two things are happening there, right? Like one is abortion and Dobbs fresher as an issue and more top of mind. But two, I think the sense that my vote in this election is going to meaningfully change economic outcomes was probably lower than it is today. And again, I do think right now, some of what abortion as an issue is about isn't just abortion. It's what are your values? Do you believe in freedom, to use the language of the Harris campaign, and language that they've adopted because they know it resonates and they know that they can connect Trump's stance on abortion and the Republican Party's stance on abortion to a perspective on freedom in a way that is useful for them.
This is kind of a mind blower. Much of the issue landscape continues to favor Trump, especially immigration. Distilled, Trump seems to be winning on a lot of the major issues, but Harris is ahead, at least in terms of national polls. Why is that? He's all right on the issues, but not right enough to be president. She's not as right on the issues, but maybe is seen as a good bet or a good fit to be president. How do you square the head and the heart?
I think this really gets at this idea of, do I agree with this person and do I believe they can make a difference on this issue for me? Do I believe they have the ability as a leader to move the needle in a way that actually helps me and not just have a policy perspective that aligns with my own? We did a round of polling in May back when Biden was the candidate. And, we were seeing that part of the problem for him was that the lack of faith in his ability to lead and make a difference meant he wasn't able to leverage issues that should have been working to Democrats' advantage, like abortion. There just was no optimism that reelecting Joe Biden was going to make a difference on that issue, even though people said, yeah, I agree with him more.
Right.
I know I agree with him and I don't agree with Trump. Without Biden as a foil for Trump, voters are more focused on, well, he's been president, and did I like his leadership style? I know a lot of pollsters, Republican and Democrats alike, will ask a question in their surveys, we do in ours, about, do I agree with Trump and like his leadership style? Do I agree with him on policy, but I dislike his leadership style? Or do I disagree with him on both? And a little more than 1 in 5 voters often in our polls in swing states who fall into that middle group. He's not getting far above 50 here. He's not
Right.
overwhelmingly trusted on these fronts. And even in some more recent polls, I know the Times Siena polling that just came out had a wider gap on some of these fronts than this poll had back in August. Still not significantly above 50 in terms of being trusted on any of these fronts. But many voters remember and see him as someone who's maybe out of control, erratic, focused on retribution. And so there's a lot of concern that this guy going to make a difference for me on the issues I care about, even if I know I agree with him. In particular, here we see Trump is leading on immigration. He's leading on foreign policy and war, leading on crime and violence. And yet we found Harris, again, not by huge margins, trying to overstate things here or suggest she has an easy job ahead. But Harris was more trusted to make you feel safer, even though she was less trusted on basically any issue that we tend to think of as being about safety. And I think that what voters are navigating right now, and I do think it's a tension that Harris tapped into very effectively during the debate this week, is maybe, I'd prefer a little bit more of a conservative direction on some of these policies. Is Donald Trump the guy who's going to deliver on that? Or is someone just going to set him off? And who knows what will happen?
How do you think that may impact ultimately? Because remember, we're many weeks out still, even though some voting has begun in certain states. How might that impact the bottom line by the time we get to November? Do you think it will have a lasting impact? Clearly, on most scorecards, it seemed to favor the vice president. What do you make of that? Where do you think that goes?
Anyone who, like all of us, we've been through the last few months and all of the crazy twists and turns so far. So you're not going to catch me saying things are settled. We're good here. Nothing's going to change.
I thought I had you on that. I was going to use this for posterity. He said she's got it. She's got it in the bag. Right.
Exactly. That said, what we've seen in our polling is that a lot of voters were giving her the benefit of the doubt. They didn't necessarily feel like they knew her that well. The degree to which they swung to her was so fast, I think represented just enthusiasm and excitement and curiosity, and a positive version of curiosity. But she needed to sort of solidify that. She needed to get people to go from, yeah, maybe she's the person who can do this, to I can believe she's the person who can do this. Or I know that she represents not literally being Biden or Trump, and that is one of the most important things to me, but is she a strong leader? Is she someone who, I believe can be a strong and effective president? I think Harris did a good job helping to cement those views for voters. That said, we are talking about a very small number of voters who do not have opinions here. These are not necessarily voters who are closely following every debate. Some of the way that the debate is going to affect them is just going to be bits of information that trickle out to them, or it's going to be through helping to shape the narrative in friends and family members of their own that they'll turn to for guidance on who to vote for. I think some of this the benefit is going to be secondhand in that way too, but these are very skeptical people. Undecided voters, I'm sure you've seen them in focus groups just like I have, they're naturally skeptical folks. So I don't think one thing is going to make the difference, but if it turns into a pattern, if she consistently shows up in ways where people are allowed to see her, or people come to see her as this is someone who's serious, this is someone who's strong, someone who has real ideas about the future of our country, then I think it makes a big difference.
If you're looking at the data of this election, it screams it's a change election. This is a change. Now, what Kamala Harris wants this to be is a generational change. What Donald Trump wants this to be is a change of leadership in terms of party leadership. However, what Kamala Harris is clearly trying to do, Patrick, is separate herself out as an incumbent, even as a part of, frankly, the Biden-Harris administration, into something different. And Donald Trump, even though technically he's the challenger, it's kind of with an asterisk because he was the president for 4 years. So how do you make sense of that? Change election, the incumbent should beware, but my God, maybe Kamala Harris has found a way to separate herself from incumbency enough because of a generational pitch.
I think that that's exactly right. That seems to be what she's been able to do so far. I think the Trump campaign tried to elevate around Harris is sort of immediately after she assumed the nomination,
Right.
was this idea of like, we don't really know who she is. We don't really know what she stands for. I think it's difficult to do that and at the same time say, well, this is someone who's exactly the same as Biden. She's exactly the same as the current administration. And I just think on both sides, it's a bit messy. Trump, as you pointed out, used to be president. So he's not exactly, wouldn't be a new president. He'd be a second term president with a gap in between. And a lot of his messaging has been around, we were better off 4 years ago. We're going to go back to the way things were 4 years ago. It's hard to land a message about change for the future while also promising to take us back. Harris is the one person who hasn't actually been president yet, and she is younger and she is a different generation.
So not that either one of the presidential advisory teams are pursuing you for your specific advice, but what would you suggest to them if asked are the paths to victory? Let's start with Donald Trump. How does he get home from where he is now?
He'd have to widen his advantage on the economy. He certainly has an advantage there, but I don't see it as large enough necessarily to secure him the victory. From what I've heard, his advisors are telling him to do this. Many people have for a long time. Like, he's going to have to stay focused on his policy and on his agenda. He would need to figure out ways to counteract perceptions that his agenda is too extreme. And I think Democrats have used Project 2025 effectively to start to undermine the sense that he's the one who has the policy agenda that you want. But more importantly I think it's not even so much about staying focused on that as what staying focused on that means he's not doing, which is not talking about Hannibal Lecter. It's not going off on tangents. Is not focusing on grievances from 2020, but is offering a forward-looking vision for the country. Remains to be seen if that is something he can do in a sustained way.
Right.
He certainly has done it in contexts in the past. He was much stronger in the debate against Biden, not just because Biden failed.
Obviously, Kamala is on message right now, the message she thinks that puts her in the best stead. Is it more of the same? Is it just continuing to press the pedal to the metal?
It certainly feels that way at the moment. I think she's done a good job pushing back on this idea that she's too liberal. She'll have to continue to do that while still not alienating the Democratic base. That's not necessarily an easy task. I think that was a significant part of Hillary's challenge. Obviously, there were personality challenges there, but both parties contain a pretty wide ideological spectrum at this point. I think some of the dynamics that we're seeing on the economy so far, they're really interesting to me because they remind me of 2012. My firm, BSG, was doing the polling for the Obama campaign. And throughout that campaign, we saw Romney had an advantage when you just asked about, like, who do you trust more to manage the economy in general? And if you just looked at that number, you'd think, great, Romney can win on the economy. But we also asked folks who they trusted to fight for a fairer economy in the future. And Obama always won that front.
Right.
One of the things we saw in this Cook Political Report poll was that most voters were believing at the outset, at least back in August, that Harris was someone who cared about people like that. Harris needs to continue to demonstrate that. Like, we have inflation. We can't change how folks feel about costs today. We know that they are unacceptably high. But what she can demonstrate is, I am the leader who will be fighting for a fairer economy.
I think a lot of people were hoping that President Trump was going to prosecute that case during the debate. I think it's fair to say he did not effectively get there. But that is kind of the big pushback, I think, on Kamala Harris. It's really the question, you've been in play for the better part of 4 years. Are you not responsible for anything that people are feeling is not working?
Totally. And I'll note, I think the Trump campaign's ads are making that case effectively. And I think that then goes back to the point that for Trump to be successful, you have to figure out a way to be disciplined. Like, they're running a good campaign. Like, they have the challenge of someone who undermines their campaign by going off script.
North Carolina is one of the 7 states, right? And it looks like it could actually be really in play. We saw recently polling on the governor's race. 2 polls just came out showing the Democrat Josh Stein is up by double digits over Mark Robinson. If North Carolina were suddenly to go blue in the presidential campaign, is that not a bellwether of how this is going to go? And if it does not, if Donald Trump holds North Carolina, does that throw it right back into the jowls of Scranton, Pennsylvania, and places like that to determine the presidency?
If Harris is winning North Carolina, she's winning the presidency, just given the makeup of that state and that Democrats haven't won it since 2008. And that started to feel like a blip. I think part of the challenge for Republicans in North Carolina is obviously Mark Robinson not being a great candidate, which is why he is doing so poorly. I think that also maybe is creating challenges for Trump because it's reinforcing things about the Republican Party that swing voters dislike.
Is there any particular experience in a focus group you've had over the last couple of months that opened your eyes about something you hadn't considered that has direct bearing on what we're about to see in this election?
The most insightful comment I can think of off the top of my head doesn't come from a focus group. It comes from sitting in an airport bar after a focus group.
Always the best.
On my way home.
By the way, that is the best focus group.
Yeah.
The airport bar, you can't beat that. Yes.
And I was talking to, it was actually some voters from Wisconsin shortly after the DNC.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to give advice for Harris. And their note was, the joy stuff is great. Everyone loves feeling joyful, but we need a leader who's going to fight for us. Mm-hmm. And they figured out, yes, it's great to be joyful and optimistic, but you got to be a joyful warrior. Like the warrior is a key part of the phrase joyful warrior.
I trust in the instincts of those in any Wisconsin bar when it comes to giving you opinions about the way the world is or the way the world should be. So take that to the bank. I think we're headed for a very tight election. I think the whole analysis that you do all the time, especially on the swing states, is fascinating. And the fact you said, Patrick, that a lot of the undecideds in particular most likely are not going to get their information and that will lead them to the final decision from traditional sources. They're going to get it from family. They're going to get it from other places. And that opens up a whole box of imponderables.
Yeah, listen, I agree completely. One of the pieces of research I've gotten to work on this year was, as I mentioned, a survey of rural voters across swing states. And one of the things that I thought was most interesting was we found that there were enough swing voters in rural parts of swing states to sway the electoral outcome.
Wow.
I mean, for me, this was about, raising the alarm to Democrats. Like, we can't ignore this set of the population. They could make the entire difference.
Well, it's interesting because pollsters always model their analysis, their polls rather, on past precedents. So you go back to the last presidential cycle or two or three, maybe the midterms thrown in, and you model it, as you know, to try to get to as close as you can to what the truth is at that moment. But if you have first-time voters that are pouring into the formula, doesn't that make modeling more difficult?
It does. And look, we are giving our best estimate at any given point in time. But as anyone who's lived through the last few election cycles knows, like that estimate isn't always perfect. But it's a challenging thing to do. Oftentimes with our clients, we're modeling multiple different scenarios so that we can understand, well, if turnout's like this, how do things look? Turnouts like this, how do things look? But it's a tricky equation. I think sometimes, not to go off into being a polling nerd, but I think the other thing that oftentimes happens is people rely a little bit too much on that likely voter question. How certain are you to vote? Very, absolutely certain, very likely, all of that. And they'll cut people out of the poll if they don't say they're, certain to vote or very likely. We've been able to do some analyses where, we're able to use the data that we have on our respondents after the election has passed, match back to, did this person who told us they actually weren't going to vote, did they actually vote?
Right.
And many of those folks do. So campaign strategists on both sides of the aisle are making a mistake if they discount first-time voters or folks who are sometimes sporadic. We need to understand their perspectives too and what type of impact they could be.
Well, Patrick, I appreciate your time today for 13th and Park. You're already, by what you're doing, one of the most popular people in America. We can't get enough of this stuff. I know your background leans more Democrat, obviously, and I appreciate your balanced perspective because I think, what all of America is hoping for is something we can all kind of find common ground around and start to move forward into the future with some confidence.
This was wonderful talking with you, and I cannot agree more with what you just said. I am fortunate enough to get to work on a lot of nonpartisan campaigns or work like the Cook Political Report work, where I have partners who are Republican pollsters. Those are my favorite people to work with. We all have far more in common than separates us, and right. I think it's really important that we remember that, particularly during an election season.
Good luck to you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Take care.